May 1982. The Falkland Islands. A British paratrooper raises a stubby tube-framed submachine gun and fires into the mist. 400 meters away, an Argentine naval commando answers with the same weapon, same magazine, same trigger pull, same Essex factory, sold to both sides a generation apart. No smuggling, no black market. Britain had exported it to whoever asked. But the real story of the Sterling submachine gun is not two enemies armed by the same production line. It is the story of a self-taught draftsman whose design the British government spent a decade refusing to pay for, and a gun built to end one war that quietly outlived four more. Every week, we tell the stories of the engineers, the factories, and the decisions that built or destroyed Britain's most important military small arms. Give the video a like and subscribe if you want to keep hearing them. The story begins in Dagenham, Essex, 1944. George William Patchett was born in 1901. The public record preserves the date, the 23rd of December, but not the town. What survives instead is the racetrack, not the birth certificate. At 23, Patchett was not building weapons. He was riding motorcycles at speeds that killed men who attempted them. In 1925, at Pendine Sands in Wales, a stretch of hard, flat beach used for land speed record runs, he won the Welsh TT on a Broke Superior machine. 2 years later, he won the Welsh TT sidecar race on the same mark. Before he turned 30, he had raced for three manufacturers, Broke Superior, McEvoy, and the Belgian arms company FN, Fabrique Nationale of Liège, the same gun-making city whose products would one day compete against a weapon Patchett had not yet imagined. Racing was not the career. It was the apprenticeship. Motorcycle racing in the 1920s demanded a working knowledge of metal fatigue, engine tolerances, and the exact point at which a machined part failed under repeated stress. The same vocabulary a firearm designer would need a decade later. In 1930, the Czech industrialist František Janeček, founder of the Jawa Motorcycle Company, recruited Patchett as engineer and racer. Janeček wanted a cheaper machine than Jawa's existing 500 cubic centimeter model, and it was Patchett's contacts inside the British firm Villiers that supplied the answer. A 175 cubic centimeter two-stroke engine built into what became the popular Jawa 175 Villiers. For 9 years, Patchett worked and raced across continental Europe, based in Czechoslovakia. Then came the 15th of March, 1939. Patchett, an amateur photographer, documented the Wehrmacht's occupation of Prague on camera. On his way out of the country, he carried something else across the border. Prototype samples of an anti-tank device Janeček had been developing, and threw them over the wall of the British embassy before leaving for England for good. He arrived with no firearms company, no patent, and no factory. What he had was a decade of precision engineering experience and impeccable timing. At Sterling Armaments Company, a small engineering firm in Dagenham, Essex, on the industrial eastern edge of London, the auto engineer George Lanchester was scaling up wartime production of his own design, the Lanchester submachine gun. A close copy of the German MP-28 rushed into service for the Royal Navy. Patchett went to work under Lanchester, helping turn a factory built for motorcycles and machine tools into one capable of building a weapon of war. The market gap revealed itself from inside that factory. Britain's wartime submachine gun, the Sten, was cheap and fast to produce, stamped from sheet steel by the million, at a cost measured in shillings, not pounds. It was also, by the testimony of the men who carried it, dangerous to its own user, a feed system prone to jamming in mud and sand, a safety catch that could fail under a hard knock, an open bolt action capable of firing if the weapon was dropped at the wrong angle. Patchett had spent 9 years building engines to exacting tolerances. He looked at the Sten and recognized, in plain terms, an engineering failure that nobody with his background had yet been asked to fix. By 1942, inside Sterling's design office, Patchett was leading a small team against a new Army specification, not another wartime stopgap, but a weapon built to last. The surviving record gives no exact budget or headcount for that first design effort. What it does preserve is the name the weapon would carry into military trials: the Patchett machine carbine. The weapon that emerged from Sterling's design office answered the Sten's failures point for point. At its center sat a magazine, the same component that had crippled the Sten in the field. Patchett redesigned it from the ground up, a curved, 34-round double-column magazine that fed from alternating sides with a pair of small rollers fitted where a simple metal follower usually sat. A follower is the internal plate that pushes cartridges upward as they're stripped from the magazine one at a time. On the Sten, friction between follower and magazine wall was the single most common cause of a jam. Patchett's rollers reduced that friction almost to nothing. Soldiers who had cursed the Sten in Normandy hedgerows and Burmese jungle found a magazine that simply worked, load after load, in mud that would have stopped its predecessor cold. The gun itself operated on straight blowback, meaning the pressure of each fired cartridge alone drove the bolt backward to eject the spent case and chamber the next round, with no gas piston or rotating mechanism required. It fired from an open bolt, meaning the bolt sat locked to the rear until the trigger was pulled, at which point it flew forward, stripped a round from the magazine, and fired it in one continuous motion, a simpler, cheaper system than a closed bolt design, though one that traded a fraction of accuracy for mechanical reliability. At 6 pounds unloaded and just over 18 inches long, with its distinctive metal stock folded beneath the receiver, it was lighter and more compact than the Thompson it would serve alongside and the Sten it would replace. Its introduction to combat came almost by accident, and years before any contract existed. In the closing weeks of the Second World War, a batch of 120 pre-production Patchett machine carbines was issued for trials, and some, by most accounts, went further than the trials range. During Operation Amherst in April 1945, British SAS troops and Free French paratroopers carried the new gun alongside their Thompsons into the Dutch province of Drenthe, attacking airfields and bridges 80 miles northeast of Amsterdam. The Patchett had gone to war before the Army had officially adopted it. Formal adoption took another 8 years of institutional patience. A 1947 trial pitted the Patchett against a BSA design, an Enfield submission, and an Australian entry measured against the Sten it was meant to replace. The results inconclusive. A further round of trials in 1951 settled it. The Patchett design, refined and resubmitted, was judged better than every other weapon tested. The British Army adopted it that year, and by 1953 it entered service as the submachine gun L2A1. There was no civilian retail launch, no trade catalog, no export agent working the Hamburg arms fairs. The go-to-market was the Ministry of Supply itself. In August 1955, the ministry requested a quotation for 15,000 units of the improved L2A 3-Paternal. Sterling's quote came back at £19 and 10 shillings a gun, roughly £440 today. One government order, at one stroke, was worth more than any civilian gun dealer network could have delivered in a decade. The patent was not paperwork, it was the moat, though in this case the moat would later be turned against the man who dug it. Patchett's roller magazine system and the broader Patchett machine carbine design were his own intellectual property, licensed to the Crown rather than sold outright. That distinction, patent rights retained, government use unpaid for, would surface again, and Layer 6 will show exactly how. By the mid-1950s, the L2A1 and its refined successor were standard issue across the British Army, the Royal Marines, and the RAF Regiment. 3 armed services adopting a single design within the same decade, in place of 3 separate procurement fights. Production ran on 2 lines at once. Sterling's own factory at Dagenham, and, from 1953 onward, the state-owned Royal Ordnance Factory at Faza near Liverpool. A private company's design, built partly on a government production line for a government customer. The arrangement would prove more fragile than anyone at Dagenham expected. By the late 1950s, the Sterling was no longer a British Army Rifle Company weapon. It was a British Commonwealth institution. Canada was among the first to follow London's lead, producing its own licensed variant, the C1, at the Long Branch Arsenal near Toronto, with a modified trigger guard sized for winter gloves. India took the design further still, manufacturing the 1A1 at its own state ordnance factories for a domestic army that would carry it for decades. The Royal Marines issued it to landing parties. The RAF regiment issued it to airfield defense squadrons. Commonwealth SAS units carried it through the jungles of Malaya against communist insurgents and later into Vietnam alongside American Special Forces. An Australian or New Zealand soldier's Sterling appearing, unremarked, in the background of photographs otherwise full of M16s. By one count, more than 50 nations, from Australia to Zimbabwe, issued the weapon to their military or police forces before the century was out. Production at Dagenham and at the state-run Royal Ordnance Factory in Faza Liverpool, ran continuously through the 1950s and 1960s, refining the design twice more without ever changing its basic operating system. The L2A2 in 1955, then the definitive L2A3, the Sterling Mark IV, in 1956, the pattern that would remain in production for the next 3 decades with barely a change to its silhouette. In 1967, Patchett added a 4th variant, the L34A1, an integrally suppressed version developed and tested at the Woolwich Proving Grounds for a very different kind of soldier, one who needed a target eliminated without announcing the shot to anyone 30 yards away. Suez, 1956. The Sterling's first taste of combat as an officially adopted weapon came within a year of the L2A2 entering full service when British paratroopers dropped on Port Said, carrying it into a Canal Zone battle fought under United Nations condemnation and a ceasefire imposed from Washington within a week. It was a chastening debut for British foreign policy. It was not a chastening debut for the gun. The Falklands, 1982. This is where the weapon's story closes its circle. British paratroopers and Royal Marines, yomping across the peat and rock of East Falkland toward Mount Longdon and Tumbledown, carried the L2A3 as their close-quarters weapon of choice in the vicious night attacks that decided the campaign. On the other side of the same battles, Argentine naval commandos, the Buzos Tácticos, carried the suppressed L34A1. Acquired years earlier through the same global export network that had put the gun in the hands of 50 other nations. If a Sterling's magazine jammed in a Royal Marine's hands crossing open ground under fire on Mount Longdon, there was no second weapon in reach and no time to clear it before the next burst came in. Neither side's weapon failed for lack of engineering. Both sides simply discovered, from opposite directions, what 30 years of trials at Woolwich had already proven. The court that finally settled Patchett's long-running patent dispute with the Ministry of Defence sat in London in 1966, 16 years after the design's formal adoption process had begun, and 11 years after Patchett first filed his claim. Mr. Justice Lloyd Jacob, delivering the judgment, called Patchett a distinguished inventor and valued designer, a rare judicial tribute to an engineer, arriving at almost the exact midpoint of the weapon's 40-year service life. The court awarded Patchett £116,975. It awarded the same figure to Sterling Armaments, the company that had sued for $500,000, and settled for less than a quarter of that sum. The designer's vindication and the company's disappointment arrived in the same verdict, on the same afternoon. By the time that judgment came down, Patchett himself was no longer racing motorcycles or photographing occupied cities. He was, by the court's own words, simply the man whose name the weapon had quietly stopped carrying, eclipsed, as it had been since the mid-1950s, by the name of the company that built it. Soldiers carrying the gun in Belfast, in Salisbury, in Kuala Lumpur, called it the Sterling. Almost none of them could have named George Patchett. The turning point did not come from a battlefield or a boardroom. It came from a single line item on a defense procurement schedule, decades in the making. Through the 1960s and 1970s, the Sterling faced no serious rival within British service. No patent expiry threw the market open, because the design's core patents had already run their term quietly, unchallenged, while the Ministry of Defense remained the only customer that mattered. No foreign competitor undercut it on price, because NATO allies were buying their own submachine guns from their own national industries, and the Sterling's real competition was exported to 50 other countries, not sold against at home. For nearly 30 years, the structural forces that killed most commercial arms companies simply did not apply here. The Sterling's threat was singular, and it was already visible in outline the moment the L2A3 entered full production. Doctrine itself was about to change. Military planners across NATO had begun asking a different question. Why issue a rifleman a full-power battle rifle, a section leader, a submachine gun, and a support gunner something else entirely, when a single assault rifle firing an intermediate cartridge could, in principle, do all three jobs? The submachine gun as a category, a compact weapon built around a pistol cartridge for close-range volume of fire, was becoming an answer to a question the British Army was no longer asking. Britain's answer arrived in 1985. The SA-80, formerly the L-85A1, a bullpup assault rifle chambered in the NATO standard 5.56mm round, intended to replace both the SLR battle rifle and the Sterling submachine gun in a single stroke. Full-scale re-equipment followed through the late 1980s. By 1988, the Sterling's production contracts had ended. By 1994, the last Sterlings had been withdrawn from general British service. There was no bankruptcy filing, no hostile takeover, no debt figure to report. The Sterling did not die the way an American commercial arms company dies. Extracted by private equity, liquidated in Chapter 11, its brand sold to the highest bidder. It died the way a state contract dies, quietly, on a schedule set years in advance, without a single dramatic headline. What did not happen deserves its own accounting. Sterling Armaments developed no next-generation submachine gun to compete for the SA-80's role. The SA-80 was never a submachine gun replacement it could have competed for in the first place, since it was a rifle, not a subgun, and Sterling built no comparable rifle of its own. There was no late-stage civilian marketing push to offset the coming loss of the only customer that mattered. There was no pivot. The single-force nature of this decline meant there was very little for a company to do differently, and the record shows no evidence Sterling tried. The end came in stages, not all at once. Government contracts stopped first, export orders slowed next. Dagenham's production lines fell quiet. Fazakerley had already closed years before. The Sterling name endured. The factory did not. There was no brand resurrection. Sterling Armaments Company itself ceased trading in the late 1980s, its design rights eventually passing to Royal Ordnance, the same state manufacturing complex that had built the gun alongside it at Fazakerley for 30 years. No modern production line anywhere makes a new Sterling submachine gun today. The design's active military life ended where it began, inside British government ownership. What survives is the collector's world. In the United States, transferable pre-1986 Sterlings, registered for private ownership under strict federal firearms law, carry five-figure price tags among collectors who prize the mechanism as much as the history. Rock Island Auction Company has placed original military-marked L2A3s under the hammer for buyers who want the specific weapon that stood in Belfast checkpoints and Falklands trenches, not a modern reproduction. A Texas manufacturer today builds semi-automatic-only carbines from genuine demilitarized Sterling parts kits, because the original tooling The helical grooves machined into the bolt itself to shed grit and mud during automatic fire has never been fully replicated by any newly manufactured equivalent. Collectors who know the weapon's service history know the difference in their hands. The Dagenham site itself has been redeveloped for industrial and commercial use in the decades since Sterling's closure. One more Essex address where a globally issued weapon was once assembled, and where nothing visible today marks that it was. Here is the footnote nobody expects. In 1977, props supplied by the British firm Bapty & Company turned surplus Sterling submachine guns, fitted with cosmetic shrouds, into the E-11 blaster rifle carried by Imperial stormtroopers in Star Wars, and, in modified form, into the DH-17 blaster carried by rebel troopers on the other side of that fictional war. A weapon built by the Ministry of Supply to fight actual wars in Malaya, Suez, and the Falklands became, almost by accident, the most recognizable firearm silhouette in the history of cinema, issued, once again, and with a certain grim symmetry, to both sides of the same conflict. The Sterling story is not a story about a great company destroyed by finance or foreign competition, because it was never that kind of company to begin with. It is a story about what happens when a single brilliant engineer's name gets absorbed into the institution that employed him, when the Sterling replaces the Patchett in every soldier's mouth within a decade of adoption, and the man who solved the problem becomes, in the popular memory, simply the label on somebody else's rifle rack. It is also a story about the particular loneliness of designing for one customer only. No market to diversify into when that customer's doctrine finally changes, and no bankruptcy court to blame when it does, only a contract that quietly stops being renewed. Somewhere today, in a private collection or a dealer's display case, an original L2A3 sits with its stock folded, its curved magazine still fitted, its Dagenham markings still legible on the receiver, built to end one war and still, 6 decades later, exactly the weapon it was engineered to be. Next time, we follow a rifle that replaced this one on the same production schedule, the bullpup that ended Britain's submachine gun era for good. See you in the next video.